Hello, everyone. My name is Bradley Barth, and I'm a senior reporter with SE Magazine. Welcome to today's session titled Activated Charcoal, Making Sense of Endpoint Data, sponsored by LogRhythm and Carbon Black. One of the keys to enhancing your security operations is the ability to understand and act upon large amounts of data. By pulling data from multiple sources, condensing it down, and correlating it across systems, you can highlight trends, find flaws, and resolve issues. This webcast will cover the importance of monitoring endpoints and explain how to leverage endpoint data to detect, respond to, and neutralize advanced threats. Our speakers today are Greg Foss, Global Security Operations Lead at LogRhythm, and Sarah Miller, a threat intelligence analyst from Carbon Black. As head of LogRhythm's global security operations, Greg is tasked with leading both offensive and defensive aspects of corporate security. Greg was formerly a senior security researcher within LogRhythm Labs, where he developed new techniques and tools to detect advanced adversaries. Originally a web developer, Greg branched out into security operations with the Department of Energy, eventually spearheading the National Renewable Energy Laboratory's internal red team. He has just under a decade of experience in the InfoSec industry with an extensive background in ethical hacking and offensive security. Sarah's role as threat intelligence analyst with Carbon Black is to improve the built-in detection and alerting capabilities in the Carbon Black product suite, and to act as an internal source of knowledge about current threat actors, campaigns, and malware techniques. Sarah worked in the Carbon Black security operations team for 2 years before taking on her current role. As a reminder, there will be a Q&A following the presentation, so we encourage you to type in any questions for our two speakers via the interface. And with that, I'd now like to welcome in Greg and Sarah. Hey, thanks so very much for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having us.
It's great to be here.
All right, well, let's get started. Thank you for the introduction. So as you guys know, I'm Greg Foss. I'm the head of global security operations here at LogRhythm.
And I'm Sarah Miller, a threat intel analyst at Carbon Black.
All right, so let's jump right in. So today what we're going to talk about is endpoint security. And essentially the reason we wanted to go this route is because the endpoint really is the new perimeter. We have so many things happening on everyone's workstations, and there's all sorts of avenues where, you know, there could be malware or things like that that end up infecting end user systems in a lot more ways now than there used to be, say, 5 or 10 years ago. So that's really going to be the focus of the webcast today. And the reason so is because it's really the easiest path into any network. People can be phished very easily. People can be bought. People can be convinced to sell company secrets. There's all sorts of reasons why you need to start focusing on what's happening inside your network instead of focusing on, you know, the hard outer shell of the company. We really need to look at what's happening on end user systems, what data they're accessing, who they're sharing it with, what services they're using, and how that could potentially affect your company. Because phishing is very common, especially, you know, this shady looking guy here. But essentially, it's very easy to trick people into clicking on links or getting them to perform actions on your behalf. And this is a very common tactic that we saw at DEF CON this year and last couple years with the social engineering village. It's very, very easy for people to get inside companies just by merely talking to people or sending them emails. And that's why we tend to see so many of these attacks. Right here, we're just showing some example phishing attacks that we see kind of on a daily basis. They're just so common. There's lots of things you can do to curb the attacks that you receive in terms of beefing up your spam filtering and things like that. But for the really good ones where someone's called someone ahead of time, someone set up a specific unique domain just for this attack, or they're doing well poisoning attacks or something like that where they're specifically targeting your company and this data isn't really available elsewhere, you need to kind of take a few additional precautions in order to defend against this. especially with the recent rise in malvertising. This is something where we've seen a lot more recently with people just visiting common sites that they normally visit that are trusted sites. They're not bad sites or anything like that, but just visiting some of these sites, there's a potential of loading malicious advertisements that can negatively affect your computer system. So we've got to protect the endpoint, right? So the first thing I always like to harp on in terms of endpoint security and user security is training, because I think this is kind of the cornerstone to a good security program, is training your staff to be able to detect these attacks and respond to them, identify when they are being phished, when they're potentially being tricked into something. And I think without training, you're not going to be successful no matter what tools you have. So I think this is the cornerstone to securing your company, is starting with training. So to start out, you want to start with training your employees, because they're the people who are going to be hit with this most. And so it's very important to focus on kind of what they might see in the wild, why taking their system off of the corporate network and to their home network and browsing the internet there could be something potentially dangerous to the company. There's a lot of reasons behind that. So some of the ways that we've used to train some of our users is just by showing them simple tricks and tactics that they can use to identify these things easily without the need to really get the security team involved or the IT team involved. There's a lot of little tricks to pick up on where you can figure out whether something's malicious or not. So one of them, this is one of my favorite ones, we've had a lot of success with showing people this trick, is expanding on shortened URLs. And not just expanding on them, but showing the full details behind them. This is also very useful for security researchers and security operations analysts, because then they can determine from the expanded links, looking at the data behind them, is this targeted towards their company, or is this something that is more commodity malware that's hitting a wide range of targets? So to do this, the example here, we're just using a bit.ly link, very common for shortened URLs. You can just add a plus to this. Now this works with the Google shortened links, this works with tinyURL, and a number of others. And so the cool thing is, add a plus sign to this, visit the site, and you can see this is actually directing to a Russian host here with a very shady looking domain, right? Trying to run a PHP script. Now on top of this, just finding out where this is going, you can get the full details of the bit.ly traffic that's hit this link. So you can see the number of clicks, you can see where they're originating from, all the different countries that are affected. So it gives you a good idea that this is probably a commodity-based malware. This isn't something targeting just your company.
So one thing that you also want to make sure when you're doing this employee training is making sure that there is actually a feedback loop so people know if they're identifying security issues correctly and reporting it correctly. You can kind of think of it like if you're in a math class and you're handing in tests and your teacher never gave you back a grade, you wouldn't actually know how you were doing, whether you needed to improve. So we always respond to people. Whenever they report something they think is suspicious, we'll validate them or we'll try to point out how we figured out it wasn't malicious, and just kind of keep giving them feedback on their own security knowledge and keep helping them improve.
And then this leads into testing and validation.
Yeah, so I just wanted to start out before we get into the details of testing and validation, is that you really want to make sure that your security team isn't too scary and antagonistic. You're going to be doing these tests and you want people to actually speak up and report that they've received a suspicious email, they found a USB, and if they're afraid of getting in trouble, they're not actually going to talk to you. So you really have to walk this fine balance of, we are enforcing security, sometimes we will take away your computer, we will lock down access, but we're here to help you. We're on your side, and you're not going to get in trouble if you report something to us, even if you've already clicked on it.
Exactly, and this is something we've seen. A lot of organizations have taken the negative approach of kind of, calling people out when they click on links or they fall for phishing drills and things like that. We've found the exact opposite works much better with positive reinforcement. And that's something we've been doing a lot here at LogRhythm, is trying to give people a very comfortable and open setting where they can report these things. And when we do the phishing drills, which we're going to actually talk about here in a minute, we don't like calling people out specifically because everyone knows when they've fallen for the exercise, and so you don't need to make them feel any worse about it, right? Instead, the people that report it and people that respond to it and say, oh, I noticed this thing, we should take this down or something like that, we try and reinforce that positively by giving them rewards and things like that. Like we just developed challenge coins to give out to our employees who report these kind of things. And then when we do report the metrics from these up the chain, we use high-level metrics instead of naming the people directly. So a couple of these exercises we've done recently. This was a fun one. We went to one of our company conferences and set up a rogue Wi-Fi network where we tricked people into entering their domain credentials. And so this was one that we were actually too successful with, I think, because now the entire sales team doesn't trust any wireless access points. So I think that was pretty successful. This year, so since we weren't able to do the wireless attacks again, we decided to go a different route. We went with a USB drop. Again, successful campaign. Now people are very paranoid about the USBs they find on the ground. So to dive into this one a little bit, talk about kind of how we set up this campaign, and also later in the presentation we'll talk about how you can actually detect this using LogRhythm and Carbon Black. So we were initially looking at HID attacks where we simulate a keyboard using like a USB rubber ducky or something like that, but we didn't want to have a command prompt pop up and then give away right away that it was an attack. So we decided to make a three-staged approach to this exercise. So up here you'll see three files, well, two files in a folder that contains another file. So the README document is actually just a bugged Word document that has instructions on running this macro, the competitive business analysis macro. And so the web bug in the README document just calls out so we can tell when people have opened this document. Now when people run the macro, it actually ran PowerShell in the background and gathered host information and shoveled this off to our server. So we were able to gather who opened it, who ran it, and a bunch of other useful information. Now the tools directory contained an executable that all it did when they ran it was shovel the reverse shell out. And so I didn't think anyone would actually run this, being a security company, but someone decided to try and get creative, and they did indeed run it. This is something you definitely want to detect on your network. Someone plugging in a USB and then executing a executable on there that calls out to a remote host, something you definitely want to be aware of. Now, fortunately, they didn't run this as an admin, but they did have this running for a significant period of time. We didn't do any persistence or anything like that because it was just a training exercise. But we were able to track this for around 4 days without any interaction. So this kind of shows how you could get a foothold into a company very easily, and then from there, it's kind of game over.
Yeah, and this can be something that's really hard to detect if they're keeping their outbound traffic to the C2 really subtle and they're using like an AWS host. It can be really hard to pick that out from network traffic. So being able to look on the endpoint and see that a suspicious process is doing that or it's coming from a weird place is actually really valuable.
Exactly. Because it only takes one person to create a big disaster. And so, employees, there's a lot more we could talk about in terms of training employees and testing and validation. But let's move on to the next group of folks that we want to focus our testing efforts on and our training efforts. So IT staff is a very key area that we should focus on. Simply, my bullets aren't showing up here. There we go. So you want to talk to them about their roles and responsibilities in terms of, how they're supposed to handle systems that become infected. whose job is it to go pull that system off the network, or how do they report this information? How are they actually going to be involved in the whole incident response process is a huge aspect of this. And IT staff, they're the guys who actually know the most about the network. So doing internal security, you're going to work directly with these people. So you want to have them on the same page, and you want to make sure that your goals are in alignment with theirs so that you can safely protect the network as quickly as possible. Now, security staff is the next key focus area. And a lot of people say, oh, I'm in security. Why should I be trained? Why should I have phishing drills directed towards me and stuff like that? Well, I think it's a very key aspect of the entire security program is to ensure that your staff isn't only traditionally trained by going to training courses and staying up on trends and things like that, but you want to simulate these exercises internally. And you want to do this in such a way that they can learn a lot about it, learn about their network, and determine where gaps might be in their environment. So one of the things we do a lot here is tabletop exercises where we'll go through scenarios and we'll figure out how are we going to respond to X scenario if this were to happen tomorrow. And we'll go through these in a kind of planned, simulated scenario so that people get a good idea of where there might be gaps in their security infrastructure. And then once we've gone through a few of these, once we've kind of closed a lot of these gaps that we know about, we'll do full-on red versus blue exercises where we will attack the company, we'll go after certain resources, and we will simulate real threat actors inside the network and then look to see if the SOC team has detected it. And if not, why not? And where are those gaps? This is also something we use to build new rules into the LogRhythm products. And one of the products that we've been using a lot lately is called bthreat. It's a really cool company where they do dynamic threat simulations within the browser just using JavaScript. So the real cool thing about this is that you can set up very dynamic and very intriguing attacks on your network without having to use real malware, without having to actually infect systems, without having to do a lot of the traditional staging that you would otherwise have to do to set up some of these attacks. This kind of removes a lot of the overhead that comes along with some of the simulations. And it gives you very quick and easy ways to determine if you can detect data exfiltration, you can detect malware downloads, and things of that nature. And so the end goal here is essentially turn your red and blue team into a purple team. You want them working directly with each other, feeding off of each other, and give and take on both teams. Because the red team needs to keep stepping up their game, and so does the blue team. And this we found helps out tremendously doing these simulated exercises. And then the next key focus area is your leadership team. These folks are going to be involved in various aspects of your security program, depending on what happens to your company. You want to have your marketing executives in the room when you're talking about what's going to happen if we're breached and we have to do a public disclosure. How do we go about handling that? What's this going to look like to our board of directors? How are we going to broach this conversation with them? So very important conversations to have, and make sure that your leadership team is trained up on how to handle security events properly. And this kind of falls under the tabletop exercises. This is something we do here a lot, is coming up with, worst case scenario, how do we respond? And so all of this together, you end up with some very well-defined processes and procedures.
And one of the things that you want to make sure is that you have this giant tool set. You've probably spent a bunch of money on it, and you want to make sure that your processes and procedures are actually using the features in your tools efficiently. So really understanding the capabilities and making sure that you're using them, automating them where you can, using the best tool for the job. All stuff like that should be built into your processes and procedures so that people are following them in the best possible way.
Exactly. So leading off of that, that kind of brings us into continuous monitoring and detection. So how do we operationalize all of this that we've been talking about? So one of the main things that we're trying to do both internally within our network and with our customers is trying to integrate with as many other security tools and APIs as possible. So we want to create a cyclical model where we're taking data that we're pulling into the SIEM, checking against domain tools, passive total, various other cloud sources to get reputational information on domains, IP addresses, and file samples and things like that. And then feeding that back into things like our IDS, our firewalls, our proxies, and same thing with the endpoint. And so for this, being the Carbon Black and LogRhythm webcast, we'll focus on that.
Yeah, and this is definitely the #1 important thing you want to be doing, because everybody has kind of got a piece of the puzzle. And if you're not putting those puzzle pieces together and seeing what lines up with what, you're going to miss important stuff. There's no one tool that's going to cover all of your bases. So you really have to not just pick the best tool for the job, but make sure that all of your tools are working together.
Exactly. Let's focus on Carbon Black and LogRhythm. So right here, what we're looking at is a little output from our network monitor, which essentially shows packet data. So we're looking at a flow here that you can tell it's very common. It's a piece of malware that's beaconing out very, very often. And this is something that, if malware actually acted this way, it'd be very easy to pick up on. But unfortunately, I mean, the malware usually doesn't act like this unless it's like a pen test or something like that, where you're not really concerned with detection that much. You're just trying to test some things or see if you can get into a company. And a lot of people aren't even watching for this. But right here, we're just looking at a PowerShell Empire payload, and we use the default settings, which are actually very easy to modify, and you can even randomize the callouts. But essentially, we're just looking at a host that's been infected and is now beaconing out. Now, unfortunately, when we're actually doing this in the real world, it is not as easy. Because oftentimes, this is what happens. You saw in our phishing attack how easy it was to create a malware sample that would bypass our antivirus software. We've since changed vendors as well, so I'll throw that out there. But essentially, you want to have a layered approach. You want to have as many layers as possible so you can actively watch this, actively make sure you're able to respond to real threats. So right here is a real malware sample that's actually beaconing out in a much different way. And as you can see, our query up above is a lot more targeted. And so this is where we're looking for a piece of malware where we knew the size of the bytes, we knew how often it would beacon out, we knew a bunch of other details. We were able to craft a query that would pinpoint this malware on a network just by looking at flow data. Because malware is not always going to be very easy to detect, and that's their goal. They want to remain under the radar as much as possible.
Another thing that is sort of useful to think about when you're thinking about network anomaly data that you're eventually going to want to track back to a host would also be your lateral movement kind of stuff. So internal systems trying to scan, internal systems trying to connect to systems they don't normally connect to, unusual traffic in and out of really valuable high target areas in your network. We put in a bunch of network whitelisting and anomaly rules so that for our really valuable areas of the network, we can see anything that's suspicious in or out. And then we always go back and look on the host to see what process was actually making that network connection and whether anything else unusual was happening at the time. So this is a screenshot of some of the data that you can see. Imagine that I had seen an unusual network connection, and now I'm going back to the host to look at it. And I can see that these are all legitimate Microsoft binaries, but this is a very weird chain of processes to be happening. So from having done a bunch of research on this, I can tell you that this is a malware that's trying to do fileless persistence. So keeping a foothold on the endpoint without actually dropping any unknown binaries. It's doing this through scripts and registry keys. So it has a registry key with JavaScript in it that MSHTA is reading. The JavaScript decrypts, runs a binary string which starts PowerShell, and then PowerShell injects another script into Reg Server 32 to use for persistence. And that's also why you're getting so many Reg Server 32s, because it's not actually checking to see whether it's already established persistence. It's just kind of blindly establishing persistence over and over and over and over. So this could be hard to catch because res server 32 is a legitimate binary. Why shouldn't it be on your computer? But this is a very weird behavior for it.
Exactly, and this is one of the reasons we really like working with Carbon Black is because you're able to dive into this kind of behavior and trigger off of this activity where, say, you see parent process of MSHTA subprocess PowerShell. Well, that's something we want to look into. And so another thing with Carbon Black is you're able to actually pick up on a lot of the malware that bypasses a lot of the traditional AV solutions out there because a lot of it doesn't have actual malware embedded in it. It doesn't always download an executable and execute it. A lot of the attacks that we're seeing nowadays are moving towards this more fileless approach where they're trying to use built-in Windows system tools in order to initially infect the host and then again establish that persistence mechanism. And this is just becoming more and more common. So us as defenders, we have to step up our game if we want to actually compete with this and start blocking some of these attacks. And so macro documents are one of the ones that we've seen evade a lot of endpoint security solutions in a lot of different ways. And it's very hard to stay on top of because every time you start developing new detections for this, they're changing their tactics in order to get around these solutions. So over here, we were talking about the phishing drill that we did earlier with the USB drop exercise. This is actually very easy to detect with Carbon Black because we're looking at Excel, ran PowerShell, which ran PowerShell again using encoded command. We'll talk about that in a second too. And then it just ran a bunch of these built-in Windows system components trying to gather information on who is using the system, gather host information on what their IP is, all sorts of stuff like that. And so we can tell all of this right away from just using Carbon Black. And this is something where to build a detection for this, you would just say parent process is Word or Excel or Outlook or something like that, and child process is PowerShell, something that you definitely want to be made aware of if it's happening on your network. Now the encoded commands is something that we're seeing more and more common with a lot of these canned attacks. So right here you can see someone's executing PowerShell. They're running no profile because a lot of people use the profile to enable logging or verbose logging in PowerShell, which now is actually baked in version 5, which is really great. They want to do it in non-interactive mode. They want a command shell popping up, and then they're going to do an encoded command. So if you have any rules on the endpoint that's looking for mimikatz or things like that, this would get around it. But at the same time, you should be looking for encoded command all the time. And one thing to be careful with this, though, is this isn't always malicious. Now, even though this definitely looks malicious, I would venture to guess that a lot of people might jump to that conclusion. And we've actually had some of the junior analysts that, want to go out and start blocking things just based on this. You have to be very careful. You want to take apart the actual samples and decode this. It's just base64 encoded text. And you want to decode this so you can actually see what the actual attack is happening on the endpoint. Because the one on the left here is actually just a VPN client that uses PowerShell to enable its configurations, whereas the one on the right is actually mimikatz. So it's something to be cautious of and make sure you do thorough analysis of before you start blocking things. Because once you ban legitimate applications, that is actually just as harmful to the company because you could start blocking people from their ability to do business.
Yeah, and when I started working in a SOC, our SOC had incredible visibility and was very diligent about investigating things. One of the things that I learned right away was there are a ton of legitimate applications that are doing really strange and sketchy things, and you think no malware, no legitimate application would ever do this. It definitely has to be malware. So the visibility, at first it can be kind of overwhelming, and there's all of these weird things that you've never seen before and are completely undocumented. But once you get used to it, you start seeing patterns, and it gets really, really easy to quickly triage between this is a legit application that's just doing something weird right now, and this is actually malware, and I need to be concerned about it.
Definitely. So this takes us into centralized logging and event management. So how do we take all of this data that we're gathering and pull it into the SIM and start making sense of it and trying to create a whole picture of what's happening within our environment?
So this is the threat intelligence feeds in CD response. So CD response is giving you endpoint visibility. It's collecting all of the data that's happening on your hosts, network connections, registry modifications, file mods, processes. And then we also have these threat intelligence feeds, which are adding various types of information on and trying to tell you what's important or what's interesting. So we have a mix of third-party feeds, which usually contain static indicators like hashes, IPs, and domains. And we have a number of partnerships with threat vendors, and we also have some open source stuff. Then we have our first-party feeds. Some of those contain static indicators, like we have a list of known good hashes and a list of known bad hashes. But we also have a bunch of behavioral indicators, and that's where we are looking for things like Excel spawning PowerShell, MSHTA spawning PowerShell, which spawns server 32, certain command line parameters like looking for encoded PowerShell. And all of these are, we have a research team that is looking at what malware does and how it behaves and trying to push out a bunch of the most common and the most high confidence behavioral queries out to customers. So if you're kind of overwhelmed and you think, I don't know where to start, I don't know what I'm looking for, we have these threat intelligence feeds to help you get started and to kind of cover your most common bases.
And then so configuring these threat feeds, the cool thing is there's lots of different ways you can choose to be alerted of certain activity depending on which threat feed you're concerned with. Some of them, like abuse.ch, is a great one where we want to be notified of any sort of activity that we observe here. So there are various options here. You can see down here we have it set to enabled, and we have it set to send an email on the hit. So that's something, right away, that's something we want our SOC to look into if this is observed. Now, taking it to the next step, if we want to pull this into the SIM and have it alerted there, you can check the box to have it logged to syslog. And then on hit down here, you can also have it create an alert within Carbon Black itself. So it depends on your use case and depending on what or who you want to be responding to this. So for us, we have a delineation of duties where we have SOC personnel that only have access to the SIM, and then some of the more senior folks have access to Carbon Black as well. But we want to give some of the same capability to the analysts who don't necessarily have access to the Carbon Black interface, but we want to have them be able to see a lot of the data that's happening on the endpoint and be able to respond to it from the SIM directly. So a lot of these will set up log to syslog only. One of those that we do this with is the tamper detection. This is the one that alerts when people are trying to disable the Carbon Black agent or uninstall it or things like that, which is funny. You actually have a whole dashboard to track this activity. And that's something where we don't necessarily want to have an alert fire in Carbon Black. It might not be something we want to know about right away, but we do want to have it logged to syslog so we can track it in a dashboard and just trend off of that activity and at least be aware of it so we can respond and make sure we get the agent either pushed back out or deal with kind of how they were trying to tamper with the agent.
There's one more way that you can sort of tune the threat intel feeds to work with your environment and your needs, which is that you can go into a threat feed which maybe contains 55 different reports and tune out the ones that you don't care about or that are too noisy. So if you have something that we've tagged as this is a common behavior for malware, but you are running some sort of internal IT application that has very similar behavior, you can actually just flip that report to be ignored, and then you won't get alerted on it anymore. The other thing that you can do is that you can use this base query that we've created and add in specific parameters for your environment. So if you know that there's a specific process that always spawns an encoded PowerShell and you know that process is legitimate, you can create a new query based off of ours that basically says ignore it when it's the child of this particular process name. So that really helps customize our out-of-the-box stuff to fit your environment.
And along those same lines, when it comes to customizing Carbon Black to fit your environment, there's also the watch list. So these are a little different than the threat feeds, as these are more, a lot of these come out of the box, but there are also some that are user controllable. And this is a good way for you to develop queries and either alert on things or log to syslog if you observe certain events happening within your network. So just another way to monitor additional events within your network. So right here we're looking for HTA attacks, usually like a JavaScript that's going to execute HTA on the endpoint and try and run additional commands like Sarah was talking about with the reg server 32 access before. So this is just one of the other ways to detect on this type of activity. So how do we actually get this data into the SIM? The cool thing with Carbon Black, they have a neat project called the CB Event Forwarder. And all you have to do is download and install this to the Carbon Black console and then configure this to forward to whatever SIM you're using. With LogRhythm, we use the leaf format. That's what our parsing rules are geared towards. And so essentially, once you're pulling this in, pushing data in the SIM, you can actually get a very good overview of all of the endpoint activity within a centralized dashboard.
Yeah, and we really want our tool to integrate with as many other tools as possible and work as well as possible with as many other tools. So, we let you send syslog out, and we also have a bunch of integrations in the product. If you want to add extra open source threat feeds, you want to integrate with the sandbox technology, you want to integrate with your firewall, we try to make it really easy to share data between the tools because we know that you're using multiple tools, and we know that you get a better idea of what's going on when you get them all working together.
Definitely. And in terms of LogRhythm, we want to try and pull in as much data from as many systems as possible. So in a way, we're both trying to integrate with whatever our customers are already using. So that brings us to dashboards and investigations. So now I'll talk about kind of how we've utilized the Carbon Black data within our environment and within the product offerings that we're pushing out now to detect this activity and build verbose dashboards so that people can handle a lot of these incidents just through the SIM. So this is kind of hard to see, so I'll dive into it in more detail in the next few slides. But in general, this is the overview of the Carbon Black dashboard within LogRhythm. So let's break down a few of these areas here. So right here, we're showing top impacted entities in the top left there. And so these are the systems that are triggering alerts within Carbon Black, or events, so to say. Because not all of this is malicious, but it's stuff that we most likely want to be notified of. And then over here we have interesting items, which is tracking the number of threat feed hits and watch list hits that are observed within the organization. So this could be anything from a lot of the stuff that we're going to dive into later on in the dashboard here. Now down below that first row, we have the bottom files and the least observed hashes. So these are the least observed executables that we've seen on the network. Now the reason we want the least observed files is because oftentimes when someone drops an executable or something like that, you're not going to have 100 copies of it in the environment. And just using this right here, we've been able to find some weird stuff. And one of the things we've had our SOC analysts do is take any of these that come up as, not a real name or something like that, something that looks like someone mashed the keyboard, and do a search on it. Now, if you do a Google search on any of these files and then you don't see anything, most likely it's malicious and something you want to look into. Same thing with the hashes. Having the hashes right here gives you a lot of data right away to go and begin your research. And over here, on the top left, we have the top watch list hits. So you can see command line activity is number 1. And we're not actually alarming on that. The reason we have a watch list for that is because I want to pull all of the command line activity into the SIM. And we'll talk about how you can use that in more detail here in a minute. Top infected systems, which fortunately doesn't have any hits right now. But this would show anyone who possibly has downloaded known malware or who has tripped one of the threat feeds, such as like a virus total hit or something like that, something that we definitely want to be made aware of. And then down here, the top users, so most users that are triggering most of these alarms. And then most shenanigans is a fun one. This is the tamper detection, where we're looking at people who've gone out and tried to disable the agent or turn it off or something like that, which is funny because the way Carbon Black works, it injects, or it runs in a few different processes, and it has ways of maintaining itself even when people are trying to kill it, so it just notifies us, which is great. So next, we'll get down into the most commonly observed files. This just gives us an overview of what people are doing in the environment, what activities are happening on your network, and what files are being used. So this is just a top X here, so you could do top 10, 20, 30, 50, something like that, just to see what is most active on your endpoints. And then down here we're getting into the top impacted hosts. So the number of hosts who are hit with, who are triggering some of these alarms. Now, most commonly observed commands is something that is very useful. We also do least commonly observed commands. So this just shows, it pulls the top and bottom commands that are executed on all of the endpoints within your environment. So it can be very useful for getting a quick high-level overview of someone maybe trying to do an attack or something like that, because it should pop into the bottom commands if it hasn't been run before. Well, another thing that I really like with Carbon Black is its ability to do passive vulnerability analysis. So right here you can see Adobe Acrobat is triggering. So every time someone launches a vulnerable version of Adobe, which is highly targeted in terms of endpoint security, it's actually flagging here. And it's showing that, hey, the version of Adobe that's installed on this computer is vulnerable. This is something that should be patched because it's an attack vector. And so that's something to be made aware of. And the cool thing is we can do this passively without having to do interactive scanning of the host. We can just passively detect this as people launch certain applications. And that brings us to the most vulnerable hosts. So these are actually right here the people who are running Adobe the most, because at the time that was the application that was out of date. And then down here we have the top watch list related hits. And so these are just links that go out to information based on what you're detecting in your environment. You can see the top one is the NVDB site that's going to the CVE information on the Adobe application that's out of date. Below that we have some virus total links to files that flagged on the virus total threat feeds. Now, the cool thing about this is we can do long tail analysis on the data that we're pulling from Carbon Black, which can be very helpful. So right here, you can see Reg Server 32 has peaked up here. We have over 10,000 instances of Reg Server 32, which is very weird because usually we don't see this at all. And so this is actually how we discovered the attack that Sarah was talking about earlier. Was just all of a sudden we saw Reg Server 32 was pegging, and we're like, what's going on here? So diving into it using Carbon Black, we're able to determine that the system was indeed infected and then pull out the entire process of how the malware was working.
And this is really where tools like Carbon Black and LogRhythm play really well together, because you do need all of this data. You need all of this visibility in order to find the weird stuff, but you can't look at all of the data all of the time. So you need something on top of Carbon Black to kind of allow you to manipulate the data in a bunch of different ways and figure out what's unusual and interesting and not happening in other places in your environment.
And then taking from the data we see here, we have the ability to drill down into what is causing this Reg Server 32 executable to fire this many times. So you can drill down into this and get some more detail around the host that's impacted, what common events triggered within Carbon Black, the user who was logged into the system at the time, and the commands that were executed at the time that this was going on. Now this is actually a different investigation here. This isn't the Reg Server 32 one, but you get an idea of how quickly you can go from, this is a weird item on my dashboard, to let's actually investigate this and see exactly what's going on this host and then respond from there. Now, one of my favorite things with Carbon Black is the ability to pull all of the command line data that's been entered at every workstation within the environment. So one of the things we do every week is pull back an entire list of all of this data and then run searches on it to see, if there were any encoded PowerShell commands, or there were some reverse shells, or people using netcat, or something like that. Anything that could be odd that we want to look into. So we can easily pull an entire report on all of the command line activity that we've seen for, whatever period of time you're logging for. And then we can go back through this in more detail and make sure we didn't miss anything. So taking it a step further, there's a lot of other things we've been working on in terms of integrations with Carbon Black that I just want to dive into a bit more. So how we were talking about how we don't always want the SOC analysts to have direct access to Carbon Black. Well, sometimes there are items that trigger in Carbon Black that we want to fire alerts on. The cool thing is the way Carbon Black does their logging, it's very easy to trigger on this activity. So we can pick up on all sorts of activity and choose to fire an alert in the SIM in addition to Carbon Black or one or the other. So here we can see that we're firing on encoded PowerShell commands within the SIM. So this is something one of our SOC analysts could dive into at this point. Next, admin tracking. So those of you who haven't used Carbon Black Response before, there's a really neat capability built in where you can actually access the systems through the Carbon Black agent. Now this is great for incident response and forensic work, and this is something where this capability alone has taken our team from maybe a couple hours to get IT to pull a system off the network, bring it to us so we can begin forensics, down to a few seconds where we can instantly remote into the system, pull the registry, pull files, do various forensic work remotely very easily so we can either determine, is the system infected, is there something on this host, should we take this host offline, and all sorts of things like that. And one of the other things, too, is you can isolate hosts using the Carbon Black agent as well. Say you have a ransomware infection or something like that, you can choose to isolate the host, but you can still access them through the Carbon Black agent. So you're effectively protecting the rest of the company from this system while simultaneously doing remote forensics on the host, which makes it very powerful. But at the same time, since you do have the ability to execute commands on the host and run various sort of activities on the host, we want to be able to track that because we want to make sure, watching the watchers, right? We want to make sure our security analysts aren't doing anything on these endpoints that, could be exposing risk to the company, or maybe they're misusing it for personal gain or something like that. Something we definitely want to be made aware of. So up here you can see an example of this. You can actually track this in Carbon Black as well, just parent process Carbon Black, subprocess PowerShell or Word or Notepad or things like that. But you can see here we're actually using the Carbon Black agent to invoke Mimikatz and pull the credentials out of memory on the target system. And this is something that we want to track and be able to alert on. Now, in addition to that, we've built reporting into the SIM as well. So we want to do full roll-up reports around once a week on all of the data that we've observed on our endpoints in the environment. And then probably my favorite part is the automation aspect. Now, this is something where we've actually just finished developing this script, and we're working on pushing it through QA right now. But essentially what we wanted to do was be able to perform a lot of the verbose capabilities that Carbon Black has within its agents directly from the SIM. So giving those analysts the ability to execute some of these actions without having direct access to Carbon Black. And so some of the items we've baked into this right now are isolate the host, list processes, kill processes, execute a file, delete a file, create a memory dump, and we actually just added pull file and another one to execute verbose commands. And so essentially what we do is tie these to alarms within the SIM. So whenever this activity is observed, say we detect a possible ransomware infection, we want to have the SIM be able to call Carbon Black's API and directly execute these actions without having to log into either of the consoles. We want to have the ability to either automatically execute this or even execute it with some sort of approval, just so you don't inadvertently lock a system or something like that. But this is something we've been spending a lot of time on fleshing out recently in order to just make the integration with Carbon Black as seamless as possible.
Yeah, and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where if you can automate a part of your process or automate a part of your procedure, you should, because that's going to free up your analysts to do sort of more of the high-level stuff that a computer can't do for you. And the live response capability in Carbon Black is pretty amazing for this. It makes being on the blue team a lot more fun than it used to be. And kind of my favorite story about that is that we had a pen tester come in and we sat him down with a corporate laptop and some credentials to simulate having compromised a user account and told him to see how far he could get. So our security team spotted him within about half an hour and then watched him for a little bit and then used live response to get onto the laptop and steal his pen testing notes before network isolating the host. So it gives your analysts a lot more power to deal with things, which is pretty great.
Definitely. And that's one of the things we really enjoyed with working with it, is it drastically cuts down the time to respond to these types of threats. Because that's something, the scenario Sarah was just talking about is something that traditionally we might not have seen this activity, because depending on the endpoint agents that you have on the host, you may or may not even see some of the stuff he's doing. Like if he pivots from workstation to workstation, oftentimes that type of thing is missed. But the response capability is incredible in that you can just remote into a system and perform these actions without having to get do the whole middleman approach of reaching out to IT and doing that whole process. You can just instantly go and execute commands on the host directly. And so with that, thank you guys for attending, and we'll take some questions.
All right. Well, thank you so very much for that insightful presentation. And we'll continue with some questions. And let's see, our first question is, it seems like there's a significant focus on the endpoint. Why is that?
So I think right now the main focus on the endpoint is because that's where we're seeing most of the activity. A lot of malware is targeting endpoints specifically. People are able to tape their laptops off the network and use them at home outside of the corporate protections that most companies have in place. And it's just a very rich attack surface.
Another thing to think about is that a lot of traffic, more and more malicious traffic is being encrypted, so it's a lot harder for network tools to detect stuff. They still have a bunch of really intense analysis capabilities, but there's just less data for them to see. So being able to add in what's going on in the endpoint to what's going on in your network lets you really kind of see the whole picture and separate the noise from the signal.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, because a lot of people aren't doing full SSL decryption on their networks, so they aren't able to see a lot of this activity. And attackers know this, and most malware payloads that we investigate beacon out over port 443 or encrypted tunnels and things like that.
Okay, great. Next question. Does this integration help combat ransomware, and if so, how?
Definitely. So one of the main advantages to this is using Carbon Black's threat intel feeds and various other sources that they pull in, we can detect activity that looks very similar to ransomware or is likely a ransomware infection. And then by tying that data in with LogRhythm, we can use automated response to essentially quarantine the host and then give the analyst time to investigate it without risking it possibly spreading to the rest of the environment. So I think that the ability to isolate dynamically and very quickly is very key in defending against ransomware. Because I mean, then you at least get the endpoint might be encrypted, but at least the share won't be.
Yeah, and ransomware tends to move really quickly, so being able to respond quickly is essential.
Great. Next question. How do these tools, endpoint security, network-based security, sandbox, etc., how do they coexist in an SOC from the perspective of the customer?
Sure. I mean, for us, we try and use the SIEM and all of our endpoint tools and our network forensics tools in the same way that any customer would. We're essentially the first beta testers of our products, and so we really try and focus on making good integrations with the products that we use in-house. I don't know if that answers your question.
I would also, oh, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
I would also add that, you know, all of these tools have been built with slightly different missions in mind, which means they all have strengths and they all have spots where they're a little bit weaker. And so I think when we talk about coexistence, it's really thinking about, okay, what capabilities does each thing have and how can I pull them together to make sure each one gets to do the thing it's best at and kind of get supported by the other ones.
Gotcha. Very good. And the next question is, somebody's looking for a little more of an explanation in terms of how the host is isolated from the network.
So I'm not one of the engineers that built it. I'm mostly on the threat intel and malware research side. I can tell you how it's working practically, or sort of what the effect is after you hit the isolation button, which is basically the only network connection that's allowed is to and from the Carbon Black server itself. So there's a filter driver that is intercepting all of your other attempted network connections. The only thing that host can do is talk to the Carbon Black server. And it stays that way until you press the button again and say, stop network isolating this host.
Okay, great. Very good. Let's see, moving on to the next question here. What is your favorite aspect of the LogRhythm and Carbon Black integration?
Personally, I think the automation aspect, the ability to execute actions using the Carbon Black response agent directly from the SIEM based off of activity or alarms that we've observed there without necessarily having to give someone access to Carbon Black directly. That's probably my favorite part.
Yeah, and for me, my favorite part is kind of all of those dashboards that Greg was showing off and the ways to sort of be formatting the data in different ways and arranging it in different ways so you can start to see the really unusual stuff bubble up to the top and be more visible.
Great. Next question. How do you handle zero-day endpoint threats, and can you detect them before a compromise happens?
So it really depends. Our philosophy is kind of that malware is very persistent and it's smart, and there's not enough sort of QA and secure software development out there in the world, and stuff is always going to get through. So rather than trying to, fix Internet Explorer or fix Adobe Acrobat, we spend a lot of time thinking about what malware is going to do once it gets onto your system and trying to detect it there behaviorally. And what you find out is that a lot of 0 days will sort of do something interesting and unusual inside the executable that they're targeting, like Adobe Flash Player or Internet Explorer. But once they actually have a foothold, they all do the same things. They're all trying to establish persistence. They're all trying to be stealthy. They're all trying to elevate their access to administrator. So rather than trying to detect all of the 0 days, we just try and detect malicious behavior, regardless of whether it's coming from a 0 day or something that's been around forever. Because the truth is that a lot of people are not patching as much as they need to, and they're still vulnerable to stuff that is no longer a 0 day.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, great. Please go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no worries. I was just going to say, that's essentially one of the main things we really like about Carbon Black is the ability to just look at the odd behavior and then, let the analyst kind of determine from there what actually could have been the root cause of it, or if this was, say, a 0 day attack. And one of the nice things about pulling this data in and having historical data within both Carbon Black and LogRhythm is that, say, something does get missed for some reason and you didn't see the attack, you can always go back, either create a watch list within Carbon Black, create a search within LogRhythm, and you can go back and see if you have seen this activity on any other systems within your environment in the past 30 plus days. So that's something very useful. So even if something does get by, there's still the ability to go back and make sure your bases are covered.
Okay, great. Let's see, we have time for maybe one more really quick. How do I make sure I'm getting the best value out of my tool set?
Oh, that's a good
Well,
question.
I'll start with a really basic one, which is it's kind of boring, but definitely read the manual. Understand all of the capabilities it has, all of the interesting things you can do. Talk to other customers. We try to make it really easy for our customers to talk to each other. So we have a user exchange where people can post questions online, and we also have sort of user exchange meetups in various cities all over the country. And also just talk to the people who work at the company, the services folks, and make sure that you're really doing everything you can with it.
Yeah, I agree.
Great.
I think the more you can understand about your products, the better. And part of that is documentation and talking to people. Make sure you utilize the sales engineers when they're on site helping you get software installed, and make sure you stay on top of it and that you define people to kind of run with this and be accountable for the solutions that you have in place.
Terrific. Well, great. Thank you so very much. I really appreciate your time. And with that, today's session has concluded. Once again, I would like to thank our guests, Greg and Sarah, for joining us today. And of course, thanks to everyone else for tuning in. As a reminder, this webcast will be available on demand beginning tomorrow on the SC Magazine website under the Events tab. I believe slides will be available as well from the presentation. For SC Magazine, this is Bradley Barth. Have a safe day online.